Welcome to AlzTalks. I'm Meryl Comer. It was a cliffhanger and long-awaited moment when this week the FDA handed down its decision to approve the first Alzheimer's drug in nearly 2 decades. Approval of Biogen's aducanumab, which will be sold under the brand name Aduhelm, came with a cautionary green light. Headlines of the announcement range from a mix of celebration as a monumental day for science to controversy over the need for more data. Our goal in the next hour is to map out what the FDA decision means and what's next for the Alzheimer's community. Joining us is Us Against Alzheimer's chairman and co-founder, George Vradenburg, its chief operating officer, Russ Paulsen. Representing Biogen, we have Samantha Haeberlein, who is the lead scientist on aducanumab, Karin Hellsvik, head of patient advocacy and external communications. We will also be hearing later from trial participants, Geri and Jim Taylor, and Jason Resendez, executive director of Us Against Alzheimer's Center for Brain Equity. Welcome, everyone. We are just 2 days into this decision. Samantha, I assume you haven't slept. Can you share the reaction of your team and personally having devoted more than 2 decades of your career to our cause?
Thank you, Meryl. And it hasn't been much sleep for some time. The way a PDUFA works is that we know the day and we anticipate receiving a communication from the agency. And so we tried to have a normal day at the office, and I was with my team discussing some of our programs in Huntington's disease when the letter came through to my computer. And even though we were awaiting this decision and had prepared ourselves, I stood up and received a hug from one of my clinical team and frankly broke down in tears and sobbed in her arms for some time, because this is really the culmination of a great deal of perseverance, determination, and following the science, but mostly to be able to bring forward a treatment for patients with Alzheimer's disease that actually addresses the defining pathology of the disease. That's a first treatment that does this. Is just, it's overwhelming. And I would say that joy for that prospect for patients is really the feeling here at Biogen.
Well, thank you. George, this has always been part of your vision about what was going to happen, a first-in-class drug.
First in class, not necessarily the last drug in the scheme. My guess is that a lot of companies will be stepping up now, seeing how much their stock price rose, to invest more in this space, and that's terrific. But you always need a first mover, and Biogen has been the first mover here. The first follower will also be important, but the first mover is critical because you'll never get a follower unless you get a mover. Now, it was a very exciting day for patients, so we sort of echoed the joy that Samantha has described on the patient side. It's the first therapy we've seen in 17 years, first disease-modifying therapy in history, and there has been so much nihilism in the field. No, nothing can be done. No, we don't have any. We've had 500 trials fail, and doctors say, well, why should I diagnose this disease when there's nothing to do about it? And even if I diagnose it, I'm not so sure I'm going to tell my patient because I'm just giving them a fatal verdict. So this has been an exciting day. It's the first day in the beginning of the end of this disease. It's going to take us a while. There are going to be bumps along the way. There are a lot of other issues, which I'm sure you'll have us explore. But this is the first day of the end of this disease, the beginning of the end.
Russ, let me ask you, there are more questions than answers right now. What are you hearing from the Alzheimer's community?
We know that we talked to patients over the years, and it's still the case. this drug gives people time. And we've heard from patients years and years and years. Time is what matters here. And those of us who've lost somebody prematurely, we all know we would give a right arm for a little more time with that person. And now people have that opportunity. So we hear a lot of joy from people who say, finally, I've got hope.
I think our A-list survey that was fielded in January showed that about 78% of those already diagnosed and 87% of those who were at risk said it was important to have access. For whatever time it gave them, it was important, and they did want the FDA to listen. Karin, you've worked so hard to listen to our community and share what could be shared. I assume you haven't slept either. How personal is this to you? Were you in the room with Samantha?
I wasn't, but I got the note very quickly from Samantha. Thank you also for inviting us. Thank you for giving us this opportunity. It's been, as you know, we worked so closely. It's been such a rocky road. I have seen, as I think many, the personal impact on Alzheimer's disease, and we know how devastating that is. I moved in 2016, as you know. I took my family from Switzerland to work on this program. And there were times when I was thinking and wondering if that was a good decision, knowing that I have two girls in school and what did I put them through? And being here then today or 2 days after this decision is just, it's remarkable. So I think I'm sleep deprived and also I feel emotional still.
I spoke yesterday with advocates Geri and Jim Taylor, who did participate in the aducanumab trials. Geri Taylor, a retired nurse, health administrator, was first diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment 2012, first enrolled in the clinical trial in 2015. So they've been in the trial now for 7 years. I asked them to describe their reaction to this week's announcement. Let's listen.
I am very delighted that the drug is going forward. And this is uplifting, I think, for many, many people, but for myself, I can say that I'm really happy that it will continue and more people will get the drug because I feel that it did help me during this time.
Jim, has this been a roller coaster experience? You're on the front lines.
Up and down, absolutely, Meryl. We pursued this particular clinical trial after having read some preliminary information about it, and we were very fortunate to get in. The prime stage 1, less than 200 people were in that study, but then it was declared successful, very good results. Then we had to wait 3 years for phase 3 to fill up. Geri continued to be on the treatment, but as you know, a year into that phase 3 study, it was declared a failure, and that was very challenging emotionally. But we always had a sense that it was experimental. Of course, then 6 months later, it was declared a success, and FDA approval was sought. And so really yesterday, Monday, was a capstone with the approval announcement, and really more than we dared hope.
There's been considerable controversy surrounding the approval already. What do you say to those physicians who are already on record saying there's not enough data and they won't prescribe it? Jim?
Well, I have to respect their decision, but to me, the authoritative body, FDA, should be the last call. And I'm sorry that physicians would consider denying a potential disease-modifying treatment to someone who could benefit. Geri doesn't benefit from being tested every quarter, MMSE and all the different cognitive evaluations, but what's been great for Geri and for people on the drug is, according to the PIs who've run the test at different sites, that their daily activities have benefited, that for a longer time they are able to continue to have a high quality of life, to make the coffee, to have conversations, to read the paper and know what's going on. So that to us is what is a lifeline, and that according to the results of aducanumab, it can offer people who are on the drug.
Samantha, as the lead scientist, I mean, it must be touching to hear the people who have been in the trials and how they respond. The questions are coming in from the audience, but the FDA approved the drug under its accelerated approval program. What does that mean, and what happens next, especially for those who are already enrolled in EMBARK, actually Geri, she's a participant.
Thank you for the question, Meryl. And the first thing I'd like to say is that the ongoing trial called EMBARK will continue as planned. All patients in that trial are receiving the active and now marketed dose of Aduhelm, which is 10 milligrams per kilogram. And that's an important study that will continue to help us learn more about long-term safety and also efficacy of Aduhelm in patients who've now, like Geri, been receiving the drug for some time. But let me touch a little bit on accelerated approval, because this is a really important point. And you know, I really want to speak a little bit about what is accelerated approval, but then also what does that mean for aducanumab or Aduhelm. You're going to have to forgive me. I'm going to have to retrain what I call this. So if I use both, please give me some grace period. So accelerated approval pathway is one of the pathways that the FDA has available under their expedited programs. And the aim of those various expedited programs are to bring forward medicines for patients with a high unmet medical need. It's a mechanism, accelerated approval, that's been used to pave the way, to bring and open new areas, just as we're talking about here. So in oncology, there have been many first-in-class molecules that have been first approved through the accelerated approval pathway. And also in neurological disorders, Biogen is a company with multiple programs in multiple sclerosis. The first ever treatment in multiple sclerosis was approved in 1993 by accelerated approval. And it did precisely what we hope will happen with aducanumab. It will bring a new treatment to patients, but it'll also pave the way for more innovation. There are now more than 22 molecules that are approved for the treatment of multiple sclerosis. So that's the kind of aim for the accelerated approval pathway, and it has been proven over and over in other diseases. Now, accelerated approval, there are some conditions. It needs to be in serious or life-threatening diseases, and that's exactly what Alzheimer's is, but also diseases that have an unmet medical need. And that's also the case in Alzheimer's disease. We do have treatments for symptoms, but we've not had until now a treatment that fundamentally addresses the disease. So those conditions are what's required. It's also an approval on the basis of a surrogate marker, which is a biomarker. It's either imaging or a laboratory measure. And that marker is deemed by the FDA to be reasonably likely to predict the clinical benefit. In Aduhelm's case, the biomarker that is the surrogate marker is the reduction of the amyloid plaque pathology. We measured that in all 3 of the clinical trials that we conducted to assess efficacy of Aduhelm. So the PRIME phase 1b that Geri was in is where we saw that dose-dependent and time-dependent reduction in amyloid plaque biomarker. We also saw it in the 2 phase 3s. So that's the basis of the approval. And then there's a condition. And this is a good topic for us to discuss more, which is we are obligated and will happily conduct an additional clinical trial to verify the clinical benefit of aducanumab to bring forward more clinical data to confirm the effect of aducanumab.
Thank you. We'll get back to some of these issues about eligibility, but George and Karin, is our healthcare system ready for a first-in-class drug? George?
The answer is no. I think clinicians are going to have to figure this out. The FDA issued what is called a wide label, which basically means that they approve the drug for use for the treatment of Alzheimer's. The clinical trial focused on those with MCI and early AD. So doctors, I believe, with the help of Biogen, are going to probably focus their efforts on those with MCI and early Alzheimer's disease. That means that they're going to have to pay a lot more attention to complaints about possible brain decline or cognitive decline on the part of patients, and then deal with it rather than ignoring them or saying, come back next year and let's see if it is continuing, which is exactly the wrong response. So doctors are going to have to figure this out, and they, I think, will. It will take some time. But the health system also has to figure out how to pay for this drug. And I think we will work with Medicare, and we will work with private insurers to understand the issues presented to them. For patients, it is what is our out-of-pocket expense. So by and large, the extent that this is a Medicare population, most of the out-of-pocket expenses are going to be modest. With that said, $10,000 a year, which is roughly 20% the copay for drugs, and a $50,000 price a year, it'll be about $10,000 for a year's treatment. And while that is affordable for many people it is not. And so that Biogen has offered some help to cover some of the diagnostic costs, but we will be working with insurers to try and get that out-of-pocket expense down for individuals, because we really want everybody in the United States who is right for this drug to get this drug and not have price be the impediment.
Before we come back to you, Samantha, on eligibility, Russ, we know it's early, but what does this mean for the work of Us Against Alzheimer's?
So Us Against Alzheimer's has for years worked on two things that are going to be really important for this. George just talked about the medical system. And we know that about half of Alzheimer's cases and mild cognitive impairment cases are not caught, are not diagnosed until they progress to pretty severe stages. We've worked for years on programs we call early intervention, trying to detect and then diagnose the disease early. Those were theoretically important for years. Now that there's a drug that targets early, those become really, really important. Part of that is a new website and phone number that we launched, Meryl, as you know, and we talked about it in our previous AlzTalk, called Brain Guide. It's at mybrainguide.org, mybrainguide.org, or 866-BRAIN-411, 866-BRAIN-411, that helps people figure out, is this thing that I'm seeing in myself or in someone I care about normal aging, or is this something that may be more indicative of Alzheimer's? And then it gives them the tools to talk to their doctor about that, if they are in a position where they should be talking to their doctor about that. So that early intervention work that we've been doing, the website, working with providers to try to understand their hurdles to earlier intervention, becomes really, really important. And my colleague Jason will talk in a minute about our health equity work, but access and equity are going to be really, really important. One of the things that we know about clinical practice in the United States, especially when you get to the specialists who will probably be prescribing this drug, is that differentially, people of color don't have access to that, don't utilize that. And we're going to all have a lot of work to do to make sure that not only is price not an impediment, but the disparities in healthcare that plague the United States in particular don't stand in the way of access. So our continued work on early intervention, our continued work on health equity, and George talked about our work on access, they just all become not about some theoretical down the road thing, but instead become about a very real and very urgent thing now.
Samantha, who is eligible to get the drug? I think that's on the top of everyone's mind.
Thank you, Meryl. In the label, the prescribing information available for Aduhelm, it's very clear who were in our clinical trials, and therefore which patients do we know what data we have achieved at this point. And so, as George was pointing out, we had patients with MCI due to Alzheimer's disease or mild Alzheimer's disease dementia in those trials. And that spanned an MMSE of between 20 to 30. And so we know the efficacy in that patient population. We know the amyloid plaque reduction in those patients. The indication statement, in line with a couple of things, does actually speak to for the treatment of patients with Alzheimer's disease. It's been described as broad, but let me point out a couple of things about that. Progressive neurological diseases, we give them phases such as MCI or such as mild, but we also know those aren't really discrete stages. In fact, patients progress through them, but sometimes not even linearly. On one day, somebody might fall into the mild category and then maybe fall back to the MCI. It's a progressive disease. It's not discrete stages. And so by indicating Alzheimer's disease as a whole, we believe that this is in line with the contemporary labeling from the FDA for progressive neurological disorders, just giving the disease name and then indicating in the clinical trial section where we do have that data. We also believe that this is empowering physicians to understand that it is indicated for Alzheimer's disease where we do have data and where we don't have data. And so a physician who might be faced with a patient, for example, with an MMSE of 22 versus 21, does that mean they're in or out? Such a fine line is really not helping a physician to give that kind of guidance. So we believe this is empowering the physician to consider the patient that they have and the data that is presented in the label. And as George pointed out, we understand where we have efficacy, and so we believe there is this window of opportunity. Patients at the earlier symptomatic stages where we have seen efficacy is the patient population that we believe physicians should be initially working with.
The questions coming in from the audience are falling into about 4 or 5 buckets. Eligibility, safety is up next. Is that an ongoing question?
Thank you for the question. So our clinical trials were quite large, and we have a database of over 3,000 patients who had at least one dose of Aduhelm. And so therefore the safety is quite well characterized in those clinical trials. What we do have is the most common adverse event for patients receiving Aduhelm is the amyloid-related imaging abnormality, or ARIA. That word may be familiar to this community, but let me describe it a little bit. It's something that we have discovered that is associated with antibodies that remove amyloid beta plaque, so including Aduhelm. In our clinical trials, we had 40% in those individuals on the high dose versus 10% on placebo. So just to point out that this is something that does also occur naturally with patients who have Alzheimer's disease. But nonetheless, this was our most common adverse event, is detected by MRI. And we had 8 MRIs through the 18 months of our clinical trials so that we could observe and characterize as closely as possible what the consequences of one of these ARIA events were. What we learned is that nearly 3/4, in fact, of patients who had one of these detected by MRI had no symptoms associated with them. So fully, the majority of people actually weren't aware that they had an ARIA event in their brain. For the patients who did have symptoms, the most common symptoms were headache or dizziness, and most were of mild and moderate severity. So not many patients have symptoms, and the vast majority, 98% of all ARIA, actually resolved itself through the period of observation in the clinical trials. In the label, we now have monitoring for ARIA. Patients will have a baseline MRI before initiating treatment, and then they will have 2 MRIs that are placed at time points in the up titration of the doses in order to capture the vast majority of the timing of these events.
Thank you. The other big issue that has come up in many of the questions are access and equity. So I'd like to invite Jason Resendez, Executive Director of UsAgainstAlzheimer's Center for Brain Health Equity. Jason, welcome. First reaction to the news and the issues that you see that will be coming forward.
Sure. Thanks all for having me. Always a pleasure. I mean, for me, it signaled the need to double down on racial and health justice in this work. It's certainly exciting that there are more treatment options today than there were yesterday, but there's a long road ahead to make sure that those options are equally accessible to all the families that need them. We've talked a lot about what those issues are, and that means including Latinos and Black Americans in this work. Latinos are 1.5 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's than non-Hispanic whites, Black Americans who are 2 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's. And I think it has to start with ensuring equity in the confirmatory phase 4 trial to ensure that it's much more diverse than prior trials. And in the process, helping us all understand whether it's effective in patients with high risk, including the communities I just mentioned. It also means focusing on equity in early detection and brain health. I mean, as of today, there are major disparities in the detection of Alzheimer's among people of color. In fact, there was a major study just released of California's Medicare program that found major disparities in early detection and in timely diagnosis among Black, Latinos, and Asian beneficiaries. They were much less likely to receive an early and actionable diagnosis compared to their white counterparts. And clearly, this is a therapeutic that's going to be most effective in folks at the earliest stages of the disease. And without a focus on early detection and equitable access to providers, we're going to see many communities left out of these breakthroughs. So for this news to bring about meaningful change for these families, we have to commit to prioritizing equity across the board, from basic research to affordability, as George mentioned, but also to improved care for those at the latest stages of the disease. I mean, really, this is a comprehensive approach that we have to take, that this news makes much more exciting, brings a lot of energy into the field, but certainly underscores the work ahead.
Karin, I'm certain that you and your team have been very sensitive to these issues. Even in the early stages, there are issues of recruitment. How do we get ahead of this? And to Samantha, what do we do in the next trial to make these accommodations? Karin?
Yeah, I'll have to start. So I think also going back to what we said in the beginning, that we've crossed one finish line, but it's not over. We're starting a new chapter. We're very focused on providing access. Biogen and ASI, we have launched several different initiatives with the intention to support access to patients who may benefit. And these span from disease education to what can we do to support the diagnostic pathway, and also patient assistance. And I'm very pleased to share, and you may have seen this, that we have made a biomarker testing program available through LabCorp and Mayo. And that is with the aim to help remove barriers to diagnosis. So through these programs, physicians and patients can access CSF laboratory testing to aid in their diagnosis. And this lab test will be available at no charge for patients. And this goes to what Samantha was talking about, confirming amyloid. So we believe this is very important. We also have a few other initiatives, and I want to start by just sharing. We have Biogen support service coordinators. They're available now to provide one-on-one support. And they can answer any questions related to Alzheimer's, specifically related to ADUHELM. And they're also assessing financial assistance options for patients. They can also help locate providers and locate infusion sites. All of those different pieces along the patient journey that will be critical now when we want to make sure that people get access. Thinking about what you said, Jason, I think it's so true. It's also about starting the discussion about brain health. I think stigma is what we really need to address, and that looks different in different populations. We have two initiatives that I wanted to just talk a bit about. It's an initiative with CVS Health, and it's focused on the importance of brain health screening and disease education. And as part of this initiative, screenings will be available through CVS Health. Patients can also get a personal, they can consult on site based on their personal results. This program with CVS Health starts in September in 14 cities, and I have the cities. I don't have them. I can't do them on top of my head, but I have them. I'll send them to you, Meryl. I'm also happy to share with you the phone number to the Biogen support service coordinators. The last thing I wanted to share was we're working with the National Association of Free and Charitable Clinics, NAFC. They have 1,400 clinics that focus on helping medically underserved populations. And we are starting with them to develop a program to support brain health and education. And I'm excited to come back and share more about these initiatives, but I really hope, and I think our ambition is that this will address some of the barriers we've seen when it comes to even getting into the system.
This is a very complicated disease. Samantha, you have the honor of designing this next trial.
I do.
Tell us what the timeline is, what your view is, how it's going to be mounted.
Sure, I'll tell you what I can about that, but first I'll reflect on the question that Jason asked on underserved and underrepresented populations or communities in that particular trial. And you know, this is a complex topic. There are actually many reasons that there is that underrepresentation. But when it comes to a clinical trial, there are certain levers that we can pull. And so some of them, for example, are the placement of the clinical trial testing sites, making them, you know, being more diverse in our own selection of these sites, being within the communities that they need to serve, but also having clinicians and staff who represent that community themselves or are culturally sensitive to those communities, which has an educational component to it. So as Karin said, we are really very committed to moving the needle on that in this next clinical trial, but in fact in all of the Alzheimer's clinical trials that my group oversees, and not limited to Alzheimer's disease. So this is an issue across therapeutic areas and across the industry, and we all do need to make a concerted effort, and we are committed to do so. In relation to the phase 4 trial itself, we actually don't have a very detailed design at this point in time. This is something that we need to work on together with the agency. This is something that one has to agree with the agency that fits the requirements of verifying the clinical effect in an appropriate patient population, of sufficient duration and with an appropriate clinical endpoint. So each of those pieces are what we are in dialogue with the agency on. This will be a placebo-controlled clinical trial, which, you know, we understand brings some additional challenges in the context of a marketed therapeutic. And so we have a number of thoughts about how to mitigate that particular aspect of it.
So George and Russ, 60% of people never get diagnosed. So what do you see in terms of the energy around early detection and diagnosis? We've been talking about it, but without a first-in-class drug, nothing to offer before.
Well, I think patients are now going to be calling their doctors, and the doctors are going to really begin to really understand how to get into the issues of brain health and early detection. PET scans, as at the moment, are not reimbursed by Medicare. I hope to change that in the near future. But there will be in the next year or two, I think, a scaled ability to get blood tests, at which point the primary care physician becomes a much bigger player than the neurologist, who typically would now prescribe a PET scan. So I do think that, in fact, very quickly, we're going to see blood-based biomarkers, blood-based diagnostics come to market at scale and enable primary care physicians to be able to detect beta amyloid in people's brains via a blood draw. There are also new digital tools that are coming online that may give us the ability to have a continuous assessment of our own cognitive capabilities, so that, in fact, we can detect earlier if we use our cell phones and take a particular voice test or a particular digital test every quarter, every 3 months, to detect whether our own cognitive abilities are declining and giving us a better signal that we ought to talk to our doctors and get one of those blood tests. So I think there are barriers in front of us right now in terms of access to diagnostics and getting a medical profession that knows how to deal with this at the primary care level. But I think those barriers are going to be overcome in the next year or two. I just think that this is now going to happen, and it's now going to become, as you and a number of people, including Russ, have mentioned, this is now real. And I think doctors are going to hear about it from their patients, and they're going to have to respond.
Russ, you've already had that reaction through Brain Guide, where what, 135,000 have responded. So you know the need is out there. People are curious. Were you blown away by the first wave?
I mean, tens of thousands. As you said, 130,000 people have gone through mybrainguide.org, which I would be remiss in not crediting Biogen for making possible with their financial support. It's Us Against Alzheimer's product, but we couldn't have done it without Biogen's financial support. Yeah, tens of thousands of people have already done this. It's an indicator since the end of March. So it is a massive demand that we've seen out there already. We also are kicking off, and we had begun this kickoff process before we ever knew about aducanumab, to work with providers to understand what are their barriers to earlier diagnosis. It is in the legislation tells people that in the annual wellness visit, they're supposed to check on cognition. That's one of the things on the checklist for an annual wellness visit for Medicare. We know that it's often undetected. You say 60%, the numbers kind of vary, but it's a lot of not detected. Why is that? So we have begun to work with a group of providers to understand what are the hurdles. Let's not talk about whether we should or shouldn't. Let's talk about what's in the way, so that we can work with providers and we can make this direct to consumer tool available through mybrainguide.org as well.
Jason, you gave us a list of priorities. If I asked you to pick one to lead with, what would that be?
I think it's investing in underserved communities and all the work that we do in this space. Not relying on the networks that we've gone to traditionally, whether those are providers, PIs, clinics, academic research institutions. Clearly, the communities that need these interventions, both therapeutic and non-therapeutic, there's a lot that we can do related to risk reduction that is equally as exciting as breakthrough therapeutics, that need to reach high-risk communities. And we're not going to reach those high-risk communities if we're not embedded in those communities, if we're not partnering with community health centers, if we're not partnering with community-based organizations, if we're not partnering with patients and caregivers. So if there's anything that we take away from today in terms of addressing that unmet need, it's go into a community, listen, partner, and think about what you can do for them in order to make brain health a reality.
Karin, I think we heard you that you in fact are headed and have already entered that space, because by 2030, that's less than a decade, 40% of Americans living with Alzheimer's will be Latino or African American. So a very, very big issue. Another question came in. Samantha, can you project the first start of the next trial, and how do we get in?
Well, the first thing I'll say is aducanumab or Aduhelm is available today. Your physician can prescribe this for you. They can order this. So you don't need to wait for a clinical trial. This is now an approved therapeutic. But as regards to the clinical trial that we will run, we have until next summer to finalize the design on that particular trial. We aim to finalize the design much earlier than that. I don't want to wait all the way until next summer to start a trial, but because it is complicated, because it will be a global trial, it is in the setting of an approval. We have that particular timeline to work towards, but our aim is to start earlier than that.
You know, we've almost run out of time, but I want to go back to Jim and Geri because they were on the front lines with you. I asked them, what does it mean to have made a personal and lasting contribution that will benefit millions of people and future generations? And what does it say to them about the importance and need to advocate? Let's listen.
I feel that it's my job, and it's a job that I'm happy to be in. Not happy to have Alzheimer's, but that's what I got. And I feel privileged to work as the way I think it, that I am working with the people or who are working the doctors and the trials to make more people able to have that benefit. And for myself, I think that I have been better as I would have been if I did not have the trial.
Jim, what does this say to you about the importance and need to advocate for those living with the disease currently?
Meryl, that's a wonderful question, and I know you personify this yourself. I was not in healthcare. Geri lived her career in healthcare, but I was not. I was in business. But there's never been a more rewarding endeavor, perhaps except raising my children, than our involvement and advocacy for Alzheimer's and this drug participation. We've met so many wonderful people in this journey, and I have no doubt that Geri has lived a much fuller life with Alzheimer's as a result of participating in the clinical trial and in our advocacy. She, for years, has handled travel, speaking engagements, interviews, and it's really been a continual up for her and for me. I've benefited tremendously, but I think it's really slowed her decline as she's been able to be continually excited and stimulated by these events. And we recommend to everyone who has a diagnosis of dementia to find their passion, to find what they really are rewarded by, and pursue that, because there are many good years in the early and mild stages of the disease.
Do you both feel like pioneers?
Well, let me tell you, when we drive home from getting an infusion, I always laugh and kid Geri that it feels like I'm chauffeuring Madame Curie, because, she feels like she's been on the bench. She's really working right there beside those people in the labs who are mixing chemicals together. And that's, people don't understand the psychological benefit of being in a clinical trial. Geri really, every time we go, she's just comes out feeling like she's a pioneer. You hit it on the head. And there's so little you can do when you have dementia. There's no road for cure. But to take what action is available to you, being in a clinical trial, is really a rich reward in itself, and helps you manage the disease rather than just suffer from it.
Geri, you're going to get the last word.
Good.
Are you a pioneer?
Well, I hope so.
The comments are very touching. And I think giving dignity to those living with the disease in the early stages, having been a caregiver for 24 years, I think it is just touching. And look what you've done, Samantha, you and your team, and Karin, and Russ, opening up a window through Brain Guide for all of us to begin to test and see what customized help we might reach for, and George for having a vision a decade ago that we all had to move faster. We would love to invite you all back again to talk with us as things progress. We have just about run out of time. You know, it's been said that it's easier to get to Mars. That's a 50-50 shot than finding a disease-modifying therapy for Alzheimer's. So we want to thank all the researchers at Biogen and across pharma who are working tirelessly on therapies and treatments to solve the Alzheimer's problem. We're cheering all of you on. Science needs our participation. So check out whether you or someone you know might be eligible to get involved. And we're going to raise our hand for your study, Samantha. Thank you so much all for being here. And that's it for AlzTalks.
Thanks, Meryl.
Thank you, Meryl.
Thank you.